the immortal who wanted to die. She got off of his body, her skin glistening and her aura rich, while he simply lay there unmoving and unmoved. This was not an unusual occurrence. She would stop by his room once or twice a week to stir his physical body and use it for her own purposes. Dual cultivation was what she called it. But he knew in reality that he was nothing but a furnace for her. A cauldron of elixir to be exploited, sure. His own cultivation had improved thanks to these nightly visits. It was just that he really did not want it to. To cultivate was to seek immortality, an everlasting life, and what he longed for was death. Done with her business, she left him to several low-level disciples, who leered over his naked body, while roughly wiping it down again. He remained still, for he could do nothing else. Controlled as he was, their thoughts were crude as were their mouths. To think the lady would lower herself to lie with this bastard. So true. I heard that he was a dog picked up from a lower realm. Not only that, it was a rural place and his clothing was just rags. How disgusting, but you know, he is a top-rated furnace and is indispensable to the sect. No matter his low birth, a little exaggerated, but not untrue. He was born in the countryside of a land far different than the one he was trapped within now. His parents had named him Xingxia. Being of a lower realm, there was very little spiritual energy there. Thus society had developed in other ways. They did not rely on inner chi but technology, did not use swords but guns, and life wasn't grass the weak cut down with death's scythe simply because the strong viewed them as unneeded. Of course, that didn't mean that life was fair in his home realm. When he was only 10 years old, his identical twin brother, Xingjia, was involved in an accident, hit by a car on his way home from a friend's house. Himself had been stuck indoors ill at the time, or perhaps both of them would have shared the same fate. His brother was taken to hospital, and his parents wept as they were eventually forced to make a choice: hold on to slim hope and fall into even larger amounts of debt due to the hospital costs of keeping him alive, or let their son go. He was angry. He didn't like what the doctors were saying. Xingjia was still alive. Why was it that they were saying that he would never wake up? He fought with his parents, told them if they didn't want his brother, then they couldn't have wanted him either. He would find the money to keep his twin alive by himself, and with that he had foolishly run away from home. There had long been a rumor that there was treasure in the mountains near his home, the results of ill-gotten gains from bandits centuries ago. Of course, the adults dismissed these as fairy tales. What fool treasure seeker hadn't combed those mountains until not a rock was unturned? But children always kept these tales alive, holding on to the hope, and so he had hoped he would be the one to find the treasure and use it to pay for his brother's medical needs. By some miracle he'd even found it, but it was not what he had expected, nor would it save his brother's life. After the low disciples left, Xingxia remained on the bed, a thin blanket covering his dignity. Despite his pride having been shattered over a century ago, he fell asleep within his unresponsive shell now that things were quiet. His peace would be broken soon enough as expected. The woman came back for him at dawn. If he'd met her more than 100 years ago, he would have stated that she was beautiful. Her long hair was silky and a hue so dark that merely calling it black seemed inadequate. It was like still water on a moonless night, absorbing the darkness around it until not even sunlight could penetrate its depths. Her eyes were much the same, but framed with a ring of dark crimson when one looked close enough. Her skin was pale like milk and smoother than satin, richer than silk. Her oval face was flawless, with bow-pink-shaped lips and a delicate nose with her eyes shaped like peach blossoms. She was not full of figure, but her frame was not lacking and would catch many an eye no matter the realm. However, he could no longer see any of that, only the ugliness of her soul. They had called him a dog, but she didn't even treat him that well. At least a dog, she would show some moderate affection before it bored her, and she would kill it swiftly and without remorse. Instead, he was beaten when she was angry, loved when she needed his strength. He was a nameless tool, kept alive by means not wholly unlike his poor brother within the hospital, and due to this he could kind of understand why the doctors wished to turn off his twin's machines. He would choose to die rather than be in that vegetable state. But this was hindsight. Through the eyes of the adult he had been forced to become. Get up. The woman ordered, and he felt his limbs respond to the instruction. The blanket fell to the floor, revealing his nakedness. But she did not look upon him as if he were a man. Despite her actions the night before, she spat out a series of instructions, and not just to him. He was dressed, forced to swallow another fasting pill to keep his body living, and then led out into the open pavilion where a whole series of disciples were waiting for him. Open the dimension. He was instructed, and as had become a habit. His soul rebelled. It was futile, though. While his soul was his own, his body and mind no longer belonged to him. An agonizing pain coursed through him, affecting every nerve and synapses, causing his soul to scream and instinctively let go of its control. The air shimmered about them, and the cold stone surroundings became lush and green beneath an azure sky. The spiritual energy thickened tremendously, and the sound of lapping water could be heard. This had been the treasure Xingxia had found that day. It wasn't that treasure seekers hadn't seen it as they sought for gold and silver, but that they had overlooked it. It had just been a smooth-looking stone, with slight color variations that were shaped like the arch of a rainbow. But to a child of just 10 years, it looked interesting enough to capture attention, and he had picked it up in curiosity. The rough exterior had shed beneath his fingers, revealing a vivid blue stone that shimmered in the sunlight. It had suddenly become hot as he held it in his hand, burning the skin of his palm. He had screamed and tried to throw it away, but to no avail. He'd passed out in pain on wakening. He'd found himself in the dimension, and the stone had vanished, leaving just a white scar on his palm. During a moment of panic, he'd escaped it, and he'd run home freaked out. His parents had chided him, grounded him, but then comforted him as he had wept and told them what had happened. They naturally thought he'd fallen asleep in the mountains and had a nightmare. They fed him and tucked him up in bed, not mentioning about it anymore. And when he'd asked them about his brother, they had looked at each other and then told him that they would speak about it in the morning. They told him to get some rest. Then they'd all visit his brother again tomorrow no matter what. Only that was the last time he ever spoke to them. In the middle of the night, he had woken up to screaming and strange noises. He'd looked out of the window to see people in clothing he'd only seen in the history books waving about swords and killing people. One person was dragging his mother along the ground. He'd run out then, but what could a child really do? Everywhere were splashes of red. There were people crying, people yelling. The strangers were saying over and over, "Where is the stone of Qishur? We don't know what you were talking about." He heard a neighbor cry out while hugging her small child to her breast. "The stone of Qishur," a woman sneered and slapped her. "We know it was activated and is in this village. Hand it over and we'll let you live." A man had his mother by the hair and his sword to her throat. Tears were flowing down her face and by the cruel expression upon the man's face. He instinctively knew that the man had no plans to allow her keep breathing. "Stop," he cried out desperately, "please." His mother's eyes had widened when she had seen him, and despite nicking her neck upon the blade, causing blood to trickle from the wound, she shook her head at him, begging him with her eyes to keep quiet. She must have known, must have realized that his nightmare had not been a nightmare at all. But how was he, a 10-year-old child, to understand? And he questioned the woman, "Is the stone blue?" "The stone you are looking for." The woman had a thin, but not unattractive face despite the coldness of her eyes. She stopped the man from stealing his mother's life with a gesture, before gripping him by the shoulder, her fingers bruising his tender flesh. "What do you know?" And so he had told her, thinking that that would be the end of it, that they would learn the stone had vanished and then they'd go away. He'd been too naive. Their slaughter on the village had stopped, but as compensation, they had taken him away with them at first. They had coaxed him, told him that he was special and no longer belonged in the lower realm. They had taught him how to cultivate to become stronger, making all sorts of false promises, such as being able to visit his parents in the future, even to save Xingjia's life. All was such nonsense. When he had more control over his spiritual energy, he had managed to enter the dimension for the second time, and as he had promised in the beginning, he had brought his master with him. She had patted his head and had told him that he would be rewarded. His reward had been a goo in the form of a pill that stole away his will and freedom to resist, to become a mindless slave for an endless future. He'd been just 16 years of age at that time, but watching as others used his dimension to raise excellent quality herbs, the common and the rare, as well as steal the pure waters of its lake in order to advance more smoothly or to create better spiritual pills, had been nothing compared to what occurred after the sun descended. The daughter of the woman he'd once called Master had learned from her mother that he had a rare inner root that happened to make him a perfect partner for dual cultivation. Naturally, the woman had kept this tidbit to herself for the time he would be of use to her own child. That girl had been 15 when she had first entered his room, but nothing like the gigglish teen girl of his village, nor the shy and coquettish ones from teen dramas. No matter how they were portrayed sometimes, they were still children. This girl had entered his room and ordered him to be stripped, looking at him with indifferent eyes. He had protested silently in his soul, begging them to stop, all the while his mouth remained closed and throat still. She then had ordered them to touch him, to violate that private part of him which made him male, and they did so without qualms. He could only watch in horror as his members stiffened against his will. He felt no pleasure from him, only nausea and disgust. And then she had waved her subordinates away and climbed on top of him, pressing down upon him. Not a flicker of discomfort marred had her face as she bled that first time. She swallowed something later. He came to understand that it was the Queen Gu, ruler and mother of the one that controlled his body, the one that had once belonged to her own mother. After that, she had ordered him to repeat a chant, one that would allow his consciousness to cultivate united with her in this way. This part had not been so bad, at least in meditation. He could forget that she was raping him, that she had stolen away the last slither of his innocence. That night had broken him almost completely. But where there is life, there is hope, and for the past 100 years, he had hoped to be free of his nightmare, hoped that he could resist, hoped that he could escape. He'd listened to those crude mouths, learning much, for they had no filters in front of him. Perhaps they were unaware that he had consciousness behind his dull eyes, that while his shell was a mere puppet, his soul remained awake. He'd learned about the Gu, for instance, where it was located in his stomach, and he'd learned about when his former master had encountered a bottleneck in her cultivation. Unfortunately, she had later broken through it after fighting with a mysterious masked man who'd managed to sneak into the sect to spy. There had been mention of all the money made from his high-level herbs, and that the sect had lured an elder alchemist to their spider's web. He too was now a puppet to their whims. Their dumb mouths had even spilled out secrets about the guard's formations and about the boundaries barrier's weaknesses. But at the end of the day, what could he do with such knowledge anyway? The herbs were harvested. The disciples took them away, and he was led back into the cold, dark room that was his unlocked cage. Why bother with a key when he had no ability to move upon his own? Despite the sect growing ever more prosperous, with its architecture becoming more refined, its adornments more luxurious, and its disciples ever more arrogant, this room had not changed in the long years. There was still just a wooden bed with its thin blanket and a small wooden table with a bottle of fasting pills upon it. Only the pills within had ever changed, but that was in number as they were used and replaced. When was the last time he'd tasted food? He really missed his mother's cooking. A sudden yell alerted him it was coming from outside, as well as numerous explosions. This was nothing new. This sect had its enemies, those that it had offended, those that envied its wealth. The barriers usually kept those people out, and that mother and daughter were both quite powerful. Not to mention there were other elders. Even if their enemies broke in, they would not be easy to face. A large cracking sound indicated that the barrier had been penetrated, and screams filled the air, while he just listened unmoving, but inwardly imagined those falling from the throats of the sect members. His lips twitched as the notion gave him cheer. He'd cursed them 1,000 times in the first few days of his incarceration, wasting time and energy. Imagined also that the slaughtered ones had not been the people of his village, but these unholy bastards and bitches. Over time, these had lessened as despair had set in, but occasionally, he'd still be filled with notions of their bloodied corpses filling the entire mountain. Preferably, he would have also done so with his own 2 hands. The door behind him shattered as it swung open and slammed into the stone wall. Pain shot through his back and a shrill squeal echoed through his mind. He spat out blood, shocked at first, then reveling in the metallic taste as his mind felt control return to it, and for the first time in 100 years. He moved his arm by himself, and then his knees gave way as he tried to turn. So he could only look over his shoulder at a man who seemed so very familiar, but also unfamiliar. His vision began to cloud over, though his sharp ears picked up clearly the words the man uttered. They didn't make sense, but he really didn't care. His lips curved upwards, and as the light faded, he whispered, "Thank you." Author's note: this is actually a 3-part story. You'll understand the vague ending in the last part, I think. This uses the simplified cultivation term stages as in my 2 cultivation books, as I am too lazy to create new ones or figure out traditional ones. The immortal who was reborn, don't thank me so soon. He leapt up into a sitting position, breathing heavily. Each gasp of air entering his lungs felt uncomfortable and yet reaffirmed one notion. He was alive. How was that possible? Just as he thought this, pain flooded his brain as if every part of his body was in agony, not just the part where the blade had run through him, ending the existence of the goo, ending a life of being a puppet. He couldn't help the cry that escaped his throat, nor the tears that leaked from his eyes. But he did berate himself for being so weak. Had he not learned by now that being weak was to be trampled on and used until nothing remained but a waste? It could be said that in that sense, he had been fortunate. How many disciples, both boys and girls, had he seen be drained of all of their worth, then tossed away as if they were garbage down the mountain? His use had been far from over, so they would never have treated him so callously, though his existence had really not been much better than those poor fools. If it hadn't been the sect, likely it would have been someone else. Less than 10 seconds after his cry, the door flew open, and only now did he register that it was white. That the whole room was white. In fact, these men and women that crowded him and questioned him were not wearing the sect robes, but white coats over blue clothes. He froze as something occurred to him. Where am I? He stuttered and gasped through the pain. His voice was high-pitched and tender, raising new queries. They had him lie down as they answered his question. He was in hospital. He'd been involved in a car accident. He'd been unconscious for nearly 6 weeks. What was the last thing you recall? One doctor asked him. She was a woman. Her eyes were clear and kind, but he instinctively flinched as she reached forward to touch him. His stomach began to churn, his face turning a little green, and the medics assumed that it was due to the pain he was experiencing. The doctor ordered for medicine to be added to the IV attached to his thin white wrist. It was then he noticed his small pale hand, too small to be that of an adult. "Who am I?" he blurted out in sudden panic as an impossibility occurred to him. In that realm in which he'd become a cultivator, his memory had attained clarity and excellence if it could be remembered. It surely would have been. This small hand looked very much like his had when he had been just 10 years old, his first finger slightly smaller than his ring finger, his smallest finger just reaching that 1/2 joint. The color of his skin was a shade paler, but that was not surprising as this body had been in a car accident. But he himself had never been in a car accident. However, that was not the same for his twin brother, his identical twin brother Xingjia. He was not wrong. Life had intertwined in a strange series of events. The doctors had not been wrong about his twin. That life really had ended. Only the shell had been kept alive by a series of machines. His parents had originally planned to have those machines turned off, as it was not fair to the memory of their son, keeping him alive in this state. Only their other son had been kidnapped by a strange group of men and women and disappeared from the face of the earth. They could not bear to lose his twin at that point, couldn't bear to face the reality that fate had stolen both their sons. And then a miracle had occurred that no doctor could explain. Their hospitalized, brain-dead son had woken. He didn't have the heart to tell them that he was not Xingjia, but their other son Xingxia, the one who had been kidnapped. The whole village had been shunned, looked at like some bad stars by nearby villages. The police had been baffled by the strangeness of the crime. More than 10 had been murdered and 1 child whisked away. But there were no clues to the whereabouts of the criminals, nor for the murder weapons, which had been swords instead of knives or guns. No Chinese mafia had ever bothered with a small, run-down village near a mountain with no value. its only claim to fame being legends that had long since been proven untrue. The village could only suffer in silence. Many moved away after that, selling everything they owned for a deposit for a place in a faraway town, even if that place was tiny and part of an apartment duplex. Better than staying here with haunted memories. He and his parents did not leave. There was no money to begin with. Everything of value had been sold for his medical fees, and also he suspected that his parents hoped and prayed that Xingxia would find his way home. He bit his lip as he kept his silence. Dad, I have come home, but if he told them this, they would learn that Xingxia never would. Although he hated everything about immortals and cultivation, he also refused to continue to live as a weak mortal, biding his time until death. While the despair had disappeared, the hatred had burned into his soul until it was branded with a permanent mark. He wanted revenge. He wanted to see them all die. And even if he could not kill them himself, he wanted to witness his killer and savior as he spilled their blood onto the rocks and pillars. And so he began to cultivate the original method that Evil Master had taught him. Knowing it in itself had been excellent, even if it had drawn him deeper into her spider's web. As it happened, his brother's body had also been born with the same inner root as his own, meaning he was not destined to be a martial artist of some overwhelming power, nor a mage with great ability. But he did not falter and continued on. Even more determined to succeed, it was not easy. The air on the lower realm was weak of spiritual energy. He could only seek rare ley lines and spiritual herbs to help compensate him. Somehow, he managed to break through the stages and form his inner core by the age of 30. This in itself could be considered a miracle given his environment. Being able to do this by the same age in the other realm would be considered only a bit below the average. At this time, he was a working man. He was a bit of a drifter, working on construction sites or in warehouses and factories for temporary placements. He had joined and left many martial arts dojos, absorbing their knowledge and tempering his body, but never setting long enough to go through official testings. He did not need something as mundane as belts to prove his ability. He sought strength and skill, not certificates. A few days before his birthday, indicating he had reached his 3rd decade, he went home to visit his parents. They had aged and not well, their hearts still longing for their lost child. Despite having a son still remained by their side, he did not resent them for it, just mourned for the naive youth that had caused them this pain in the first place. He could have placed all blame upon the reckless driver who had drunkenly ran into his brother, leading to everything that had occurred to him, to them afterwards. Plus, who knew if some other child would not have picked up that unassuming stone and caused the events of his past to happen anyway. Besides, that man, the driver, had paid a price. He had died in prison after receiving a head injury in a riot. Whether it was a fair retribution, he could not say. But fate was not always kind and just still. His parents had smiled upon his return, welcomed him. His mother had fed him with a meal she had cooked herself, and he had savored every mouthful. And when they had fallen asleep, he had visited the mountain. This he had done a few times over the years, but not with the knowledge of his parents, seeing as how this mountain was connected to the disappearance of their child. But it just so happened that there was a slither of 2 ley lines interconnecting in this mountain, and before he'd become an adult, he had meditated in a cave here and drawn much of its energies into himself. He did so again that night, which is how he broke through the bottleneck and formed his core, draining the last of the spiritual energy as he did so. This actually took him 3 days. He had not realized. He could only apologize to his parents, make some excuse that he had been unable to sleep and had gone for a walk, only to find himself completely lost. They probably didn't really buy this excuse, and he spent a whole week making it up to them, and by the end of it, they had tried to convince him to stay longer. But there was no money to be earned in the village, and the ley lines here were now dry, and of no use to him. He could not stay. But only after promising to phone them every evening did they let him go. Other villagers had suggested in the past that the couple tie their son down by having him marry, although there were very few unwed girls in their village, nor many in the surrounding ones. Wasn't as if they were completely sparse of potential brides. Xingxia was seen also as a hard worker and mostly filial child if his tendency to wander wasn't taken into account, and a good wife could solve that issue. Only, his parents could not accept such advice after Xingxia had woken from his coma. He had an extreme aversion to women. He'd even physically thrown up when their neighbor's teen daughter had accidentally walked into him while on her phone. Even with his own mother, he would no longer accept her touch. Though his reaction was much less violent then, even more reason to find him a wife and help him get over it was the suggestion, but it did not wash. Although he did not say so in such direct words, he declared that he would never return to this village once in the future if his parents forced him to get married and his bride would live as a widow. He hated females, could not abide them getting close. But that didn't mean he didn't feel lonely. Were fate not so cruel, he could have grown up alongside his twin brother. They had once been inseparable after all. Perhaps they would have continued to be close, to grow up and grow old together. But that was not to be. Xingxia sat at the bus stop, glancing every once in a while at his phone, not noticing that at this usually deserted place that another person had joined him for a while. He glanced up after realizing that the bus was late, looking down the road only to finally register the other person. It was a man who had long, midnight hair that was tied at the nape of his neck with an elastic band. He hadn't seen such long hair since his last life, so he didn't really like the style and kept his own fairly short. However, he couldn't help but think that it suited this man. He had a square jawline and eyes shaped like phoenix feathers beneath sword-shaped brows. Yet rather than looking imposing, he exuded a quiet and calm aura, causing those around him to relax in his presence. Xingxia was not immune to it either, but at the realization, he became all the more wary and tense. The man naturally noticed this and spoke aloud. "Do not fear me so. I mean you no harm. I don't fear you," he denied automatically. Even if he was only strong by mortal terms, he didn't fear any man from this realm having the ability to harm him. If it happened that the man wasn't from this realm, well, he already knew that there were worse things to suffer than death. "It is surprising to find one of your ability in this low realm," the man continued, though there was a sparkle of amusement in his eyes. "The air is so thin here. You have worked hard." Xingxia's eyes had narrowed, but he did not deny the man's words after all. He was aware that once a person was strong enough, he or she could see through the cultivation of weaker immortals, even if they were still blind to those stronger than themselves. So if this man truly wished to kill him, he would die, though not without regrets. "Why are you here?" he asked the man bluntly. With his tone, other men of that realm would have beat him or run him through with their swords, perhaps with words of rebuke, perhaps in a silent, dismissive tone. At the very least, they would have looked indifferently at him and walked away. So he did not expect the man to answer, and could not stop the surprise from etching his features when he did. "My Grandchefu was a great man with many gifts, but he could not break with fate and enter the final stages of immortality," the man began, looking a little wistful, and yet that twinkle in his eyes had not dimmed in the least. "He left a heritage to my Sherfu when he died, but my martial uncle became dissatisfied, thinking that he should have inherited that which was given to my master, and stole it away. As it happened, he was seduced into revealing the secrets of the heritage, but that woman had a scorpion tail, stabbing him in the back in order to obtain it for herself. Were it not for my martial uncle's quick wit, it would have fallen into her hands freely. Yet with his dying breath he used a warp stone to cast it away into the void. I don't believe he did this due to any benevolent reason, however, but through selfishly thinking that if he could not have it, then no one could." Xingxia digested his words. Before his own thoughts spilled from his lips, "I'm not so certain that your Grandchefu was a great man." The cultivator looked surprised, but he did not get angry, instead asking seriously, "Oh, why do you not think so? Your heritage sounds as if it is some type of treasure." Xingxia sneered. "All people covert treasure, be it gold or silver or some artifact that can give them power. Such treasures just bring misery and death." The man's sword-like brows raised and those twinkling eyes were captured in interest. "Oh, it sounds as if you have experience in this. Many of my village died due to a treasure," he spat, the blood of those lives etched upon his soul. It was he that had brought their deaths after all, so he'd always held himself responsible for remembering them. Even in his lowest moments, he had not forgotten them, just wished he could join them. So you try to gain strength in order to prevent future massacres. Very noble. The man nodded and happened to glance down the road, where dust was being disturbed by large, fast-moving wheels. My reasons are not so noble, Xingxia mumbled, once more catching this man's attention. I simply don't want to be in such a helpless position again. I would rather fight with all that I had and die satisfied than that. The man's gaze seemed to intensify, but Xingxia did not notice, too lost in his own memories to feel the probing stare. The bus pulled to a stop and the doors slid open. Xingxia rose to his feet, but before he could step on the transport vehicle, the man called to him and tossed a jade bottle to him, which he instinctively caught. To help you in your quest for strength, the man told him, though he had already vanished from view. While seated, Xingxia had uncorked the bottle. The heady aroma of herbs poured out and wrapped around his senses. He picked up a pearl-white pill and rolled it between his fingers in awe. If he was correct, then this was a misty spiritual pill, something that could help his increase his cultivation. If this was valuable in the other realm, then it was pretty much priceless here. He thought that he would never see that man again, only that he was mistaken. A year passed, and he met him while he was working as a waiter in a bar. He was sipping the rich amber liquid of a malt whiskey in a similar way to mortals attempting to drown their sorrows. As Xingxia returned a tray full of glasses to the bar, the man began to speak to him without even a word of greeting. That woman managed to find the heritage after all. He sounded slightly sullen and unresolved. What do you plan to do? Xingxia asked, though he wasn't so much curious of the man's intentions as to whether this man would respond differently to the cultivators he'd experienced in the last life. I wish to get it back naturally, he admitted openly. However, since the heritage has acknowledged a new master, then it likely won't be so easy. What do you mean? This heritage sounds as if it has spiritual awareness. It does, and it does not, the man replied. Rather, it is no more aware than a sword. But one could say it has the innocence a sword does not. The man noticed Xingxia's confusion and continued to explain. The sword is a tool, but it is also a weapon. Thus it will only choose to obey the one who favors it and won't necessarily allow itself to be used even indirectly by others unless the wielder overpowers it. But the heritage was never meant for battle, but for peace, and as such has no awareness that what it may be doing is not what my grandchef intended. Xingxia finished placing the glasses upon the bar in silence, before walking to nearby tables to collect more. Once he returned, he spoke the words he had thought about while working. I don't know enough to be sure, but why wouldn't just disposing of its master be sufficient in getting the heritage back? I thought you hated killing and death. The man sounded slightly amused, though Xingxia did not know what he had said to make him think so. I don't like it, but there are worse things than death, he replied. That is true. The man downed the last of the liqueur with a slight grimace, before raising a finger to order another one. The issue is not so much whether or not the heritage would choose another master on the death of the current one, but the fact that the heritage would choose a new master with an innocent heart and pure intentions. That was one of the restrictions placed upon it by my grandchef. You see, my chef is a bit of an innocent himself at times. Very peaceful and carefree. He never once suspected his martial brother would betray him, and even now believes he had a good reason for it. Were it up to him, he'd let the current continue to carry the heritage from the our sect into the ocean depths. But you seek it anyway. I am not such a good man, he admitted, but I also do not want to kill an innocent. I'm just ill at ease about how I might sneak that person free of my enemies. Also don't know if that person is even willing to leave. Perhaps you can only wait patiently and see what happens next. He smiled at Xingxia warmly, his face untouched by the alcohol flowing in his veins. Of course, as an immortal, he could expel the effects any time he wished. You may well be correct, he said as he focused on his current whiskey. So Xingxia continued with his job only. The immortal left without paying, and he found himself footing the bill, reaffirming to himself that all cultivators were indeed bastards. 6 months later, his father passed away from a sudden heart attack. It rained on the day of the funeral, where a few gathered wearing black around the ancestral grave not too far from the village heart. His mother could not cope without him, passing away in her sleep just a couple of weeks later. And so he wore dark colors once more as he bid his last relative on this world goodbye. He mourned his parents in his heart. But at the same time, he felt as if the only tie tethering him to the earth had severed, and he no longer need remain here. Of course, that was only if he could find a way to cross to the other realm. It was a dangerous thought. Although his core had formed, and his spiritual sea had stabilized in the aftermath, he could not be considered strong by that place's standards. Plus, there was the added factor that his body was a perfect furnace, a temptation for morally skewed cultivators. Just like his former one had been, he never wished to be used in that way ever again. Even now this body had not spilled its virgin yang, the idea so repulsive to him. But he also felt that he had reached the limits in this world, that he was no longer able to grow and strengthen. As if somehow aware of his thoughts, that man showed up as he knelt before his parents' graves. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said perfunctorily. Xingxia did not thank him, but perhaps he'd expected that reaction, for he came straight to the point. "I have never taken on a disciple, but I am curious about you. How did someone from this realm come to form their inner core without aid or a decent spiritual environment?" Of course, I do not expect an answer to that right now. Revealing secrets requires trust, and I haven't known you long enough to acquire yours. But if you allow me to be your Shifu, I will endeavor to gain it, just as I wish to trust you more deeply as well. You don't think that I will spill all of the secrets you have already shared? Xingxia couldn't help but curve his lips upward, one of the few genuine smiles he had made since being reborn in his twin brother's body. "You do not fear death." The man recalled one of the few and most important facts he had learned about the younger man. "But you do fear what might be worse than that." Xingxia's smile faltered, and he inwardly sighed, wondering how he had managed to cross paths with this rather observant man. "Do not fear me," the man added, exuding that calming aura once more. "I really do not mean you any harm, Master Shifu." Xingxia cupped his hands and bowed. "The immortal who chose to live, Master Shifu. Where are we going this time?" The man, whose actual name was Huang Jianyu, simply smiled as he glanced over his shoulder, but continued to leap from tree branch to tree branch without hesitation, as if gravity was optional. Xingxia shook his head with a sigh, but continued to follow him anyway. Who knew what mischief his master Shifu would lead him into for training purposes this time? Still, he trusted him enough to not dive too deep into questioning, while also knowing he'd likely regret it. They had been together for half a century now. A bond of trust had naturally formed in that time. 40 years ago, the man had proposed to take him as his first disciple, and he had accepted after some thought. It had served his purposes at that time. He'd needed to come to the other realm, but he had worried about being strong enough to survive here. Getting here at all had been an issue that only vaguely crossed his mind. With the olive branch offered by Huang Jianyu, not accepting it would have doubtless been unwise. Even if accepting it could have been equally so. He had known little about this Master Shifu at that time, only that he liked to seek him out to lament from time to time. Actually, he still liked to do that, and Xingxia still needed to open his purse to pay his bills. Yet following this sometimes irresponsible and irrepressible Master Shifu of his had not been without merit. He had cultivated easily to the next stage of body tempering and was partially through this current one as well. This was a decent rise of cultivation by anyone's terms, despite his route being not favorable for lone cultivation purposes. After all, where each stage of core formation took years to surpass, each stage of body tempering would take decades. Later, each stage of mind tempering would take him centuries, while in each stage of soul tempering he could expect to linger for millennia. Of course, that was if he could break through the bottleneck and endure the tribulations that came with them. He shook his head, throwing off the notion, while keeping one eye on his master. Huang Jianyong stopped suddenly before a sizable pond into which a waterfall crashed in thunderous vigor. Droplets sprayed into the atmosphere and captured by the light peering through the tall treetop canopy. They formed a 7-colored tribute to the churning waters, sheltered by the rocks and trees. The waters and their surroundings looked clean and untouched. The water vaguely reminded him of the lake in his former dimension. Since he'd been reborn in his twin brother's body, he'd lost access to that dimension. He could only assume that it was still in his original body, wherever that happened to be. Despite roaming here and there with his master Shifu, he'd not found even a hair of one of those people, so had no clues to whether his former shell lived or had died. After all, although his time had reversed, did not mean that it ran parallel to this realm. For one thing, the years were longer here. Days and nights seemed to be unaffected by season, and the weather was ever mild of temperament. As for how long had passed, well, it was just due to his excellent memory and attention to that detail that he could calculate it with ease. He'd learned so much about this realm either from his master Shifu or from his kind grand Shifu and his martial uncles and aunts and cousins. Honestly, interacting with the members of his master's sect had tempered much of the hatred he'd held in his heart towards cultivators and the people of this realm. That old man, Grand Shifu, had been how Huang Jianyong described him, innocent and pure of thought. He was like the gentle grandparent that Xingxia had always wanted as a small child, the one who always welcomed their grandchild with a warm smile, taught them to play checkers, but made sure that the child won more often than not, who gave them a slither of cake, while winking conspiratorially behind their own child's back. That he'd survived to such an age was likely attributed to his own deceased master and other members of the sect, though he did hold much strength within as well. Then there were his martial uncles and aunts, who taught him things that his own master Shifu neglected too, such as how to recognize the evolution stage of different beasts, how ward off evil ghosts, what constitutes as devil cultivation instead of a righteous one. There was quite the fine line. Despite all their care, he still could not get close to women, disappointing more than a few of his female martial cousins, who would have liked to be on more intimate terms. They might have felt that their spring had come. Their intentions were equal companionship, not for his furnace body naturally. He'd not shared this small fact with anyone but his Shifu, but he still could not accept their feelings. But he no longer felt sick to his stomach if one of these good sisters brushed past him. Just uncomfortable. This was one of the reasons he often followed his master Shifu out of the small sect, of which the Grand Shifu was its master and his disciples were its heads, despite the man leading him into trouble more often than not. "What are we doing here, master?" he asked cautiously. "I found this place a few years ago and thought it looked like a great place to relax." The man replied with no glimmer of ill intent. That did not mean Xingxia could wholly let down his guard. However, regardless of Xingxia's feelings, Huang Jingyong leapt down from the branches and reached the water's edge. Xingxia followed him, feeling the coolness of the distant spray, the tension seeping from his shoulders. He knelt down and cupped the waters with one hand. The water was tepid, slightly lower than his body temperature, but not freezing, refreshing, reminding him of those days so long distant past where he and Xingjia had played in the mountain lake near the village. Its waters had actually been a few degrees cooler, but did not have the taint of being recycled and reused. A smile crept upon his face in remembrance. "Would you like to take a dip?" He heard the words of his master, but did not look up, therefore failed to miss the mischievous twinkle in his eyes. And Xingxia agreed, probably too quickly, and so they shed their outer robes and slipped into the cooling depths. Xingxia shivered as he broke the surface of the water, and then a laugh escaped his throat. Droplets fell from his dark hair and trickled down his handsome face before returning to the lake in ripples. He'd never grown his hair long, much to the dissatisfaction of the Grand Shifu, but it did reach to his chin now as he'd become lax in cutting it frequently over the last couple of decades. Huang Jianyong returned his wide grin, nodding to himself that he had known this would be a good idea. His young disciple could be too serious and too tense at times. There was more to life than cultivation after all. That said, a dark shadow rose from the surface of the lake, coating them both in its darkness. "Oh, so you are still here?" Huang Jingyong called out to the lake's guardian beast, not noticing the sudden paleness of his disciple, who groaned as he ventured a glance backwards. He knew this had been too good to be true. Sometime later, the beast fled to the depths to lick its wounds, while Xingxia huffed, exhausted by the unexpected exercise. Lying at the side of the lake, Huang Jingyong looked somewhat disappointed. "I thought that it would put up more of a fight than that." Xingxia gave him an expression of exasperation, tugging at the hem of his inner robes in a pleading manner. Master Shifu, really? Huang Jingyong chuckled before grabbing his disciple's arm and tugging him upward with ease. Xingxia didn't expect to be grappled this way and couldn't find his feet. Falling into his master's arms in a clumsy manner, Huang Jingyong wrapped his arm about the younger man's slender waist. Seems we still need work on your stance, he tooted, teasingly grasped in such a hold. Xingxia could not stop the blush from rising in his cheeks and quickly pulled away. In truth, their interactions had become more ambiguous over the last few years, and his heart would quickly start to race whenever they shared even a little body heat. But he didn't dislike this feeling, rather. He longed for it more. He had thought such feelings as love were impossible for him, that his previous life had permanently scarred his soul and his heart. It was just, no matter how he might want to fill this void within this life. They were Master Shifu and disciple. This was a line that could permanently alter the respect and trust that had formed between them. His eyes instinctively sought out the man, who now sat in lotus position beside the lake, warming his body in the sun's rays. He still wore his wet inner robes, which clung to his body like a second skin. Xingxia couldn't dwell upon this, though, as there was an unfamiliar expression upon Huang Jianyong's face that he couldn't quite place. There was relief, but also satisfaction, and his smile was so filled with feeling that Xingxia felt his heart once more increase in speed, almost deafening him. I've been waiting for you to realize, Huang Jianyong told him as he held out his hand, beckoning his disciple to approach him. Xingxia felt powerless to resist, but it was not like the time when he had no will. He did have will, he just didn't have the want. But he did not immediately stretch out his fingers, his hand hovering about the offered one for the moment. Realize what? Huang Jianyong was not displeased by his hesitation and calmly answered his doubts. For you to realize that your feelings for me are the same as my feelings for you. You have my heart, Xingxia. I have simply been waiting to hold yours. And with that, Xingxia gave up and accepting the hand before him. Feelings unleashed were not immediately reflected physically. Perhaps Huang Jianyong had sensed the difficulties his beloved disciple had with intimate contact, for he never pushed him for more than he was willing to give. It made their first joining all the more beautiful once the last barrier crumbled and Xingxia gave his body to his Shifu willingly. His Shifu, his lover, his Dao companion. Another few decades passed, and Xingxia realized his age was about that of which he reached in his last life, at least in terms of number of known years. His mood lowered to melancholy, as if in mourning for the man he had been and once more for the sacrifice his brother had made for him. At this time his lover returned to him, having left for half a year to chase for the treasure that he himself had long forgotten about, that same treasure that had caused their paths to cross in his home realm. Beloved, he reached out his hand to Xingxia. Will you come with me and help me finally return it to whom it belongs to? Xingxia naturally agreed. Better than linger within the sect boundaries in sorrow and self-pity. Their relationship had reached the point where, though they might separate for short periods of time, they would always return and make it seem as if those days, weeks, years vanish had without a trace. No longer important, no longer relevant. No matter how much they missed each other in those forgotten moments, all would be well once they laid eyes upon each other. Therefore, they never said goodbye and never said hello nor welcome back anymore. They did not feel the need. Just like this time where Huang Jianyong only said one sentence on his return before they left the sect together on this quest, and Xingxia did not question him at all. Their journey took nearly 2 lunar passes, the full moon rising twice, and now, just waiting for the return of the new moon for the 3rd time. When they came to the location that Huang Jianyong believed the inheritance was located, they had traveled on foot sometimes, by tamed flying beast others in order to reach this distant place. According to the people in the closest town, this was the location of the Emerald Leaf Dragon sect. The sect was said to be mysterious. Some claimed that if one laid eyes on one of the ladies of the sect, one would be mesmerized, their soul stolen away, that their figures were lithe and their scents bewitching. However, these flowers were also deadly, like red roses with their sharp thorns. It was said they carried upon their persons deadly poisons. Plus, any man that took their fancy would be whisked away, never to be seen again. How much was truth and how much was rumor? It was not certain, but it did appear that the sect was matriarchal, and that the men of the sect tended to be guardians, loyal soldiers and protectors of these women. Xingxia felt a flutter of unnerve in his stomach, a sense of foreboding. This only worsened once they reached the boundary. There was an air of familiarity about this place. He looked sharply at Huang Jianyong, and his lover seemed to be watching patiently for what expression would appear upon his face. He needn't question whether the man had become aware of something in relation to himself, but he also believed that he was not yet aware of everything. His eyes slid away uneasily. "You never once told me what this inheritance of yours looked like," he said, glancing at a few places upon the rugged surface of the mountain before them, recalling the weak points that would cause this barrier to collapse. "Did I not?" Huang Jianyong mused in his usual tone of voice, as if the two men were simply on one of their usual outings. Not that those generally ended well either. Xingxia couldn't help the upward curve of his lips, shedding the discomfort returning here had caused. Actually, instead, there was a sort anticipation of closure within his belly, as if finally realizing that his footsteps had always been leading here to this time, to this moment. Huang Jianyong's lips also curved as he nonchalantly described the stone in a few words and watched as his beloved nodded. Understanding achieved, however. "Although I have been here before a couple of times, I've not been able to break the barrier that protects them. A short while ago, I discovered a clue to them and was enlightened. Thus I sought for your help, beloved. Leave the barriers to me, Jian." Xingxia reassured him. "Just be wary as you distract them, of course." Huang Jianyong stole a kiss before leaping up onto his unsheathed sword. The brilliant weapon only revealed to sing the elegy of others' deaths. Master and weapon flew above to a distant point and began to attack the barrier without restraint. Naturally, such caused the ringing of alarm bells to sound about the sect and brought forth many to defend against him. All the while, Xingxia stole about those weak points. It seemed he attacked them at random. But in truth, while attempting to keep his sanity in his last life, he had calculated the best way to use them in order to completely destroy the array supporting the barriers. In any other order, the sect would notice more swiftly his sabotage and might even be able to secure them and see to his death, and this whole quest would be futile. Of course, he had suspected that they would not fail. Regardless, but it did not hurt to be cautious. The barrier fell with a loud cracking sound, and he withdrew his own sword. Silence reborn. The gift Huang Jianyong had given him as they exchanged vows beneath the heavens, informing the gods that they were Tao companions for the entirety of this life, and if the heavens were willing, the next as well. The silver blade pierced easily the first guardian to rush him, and the next as well, and he was not so kind of heart to leave the screaming women who fled from him alone. None of these people were innocent. They all were aware. All were taught how to breed and how to use the goo that were truthfully the poison this sect created for their own use. Blood flowed upon the ornate pavilions and was splashed across the marble columns. All this was it not built upon his own, therefore. They would pay for all of those lost years. Only then his need for vengeance would be sated. His memory brought him to her palace pavilion, where he was imprisoned in a tiny, dark and dirty corner, far from her luxurious quarters. She appeared in front of him, her bodyguards circling her, as well as the maidservants who were far stronger than the pathetic guardians posted about the boundaries. He flicked the tainted blood from his sword as she looked on in disbelief. "How did you free yourself?" she cried out in disquiet, clutching the location where her goo was yet finding that it was peaceful. No signs that the life of its male counterpart had been extinguished. Xingxia felt no desire to enlighten her, simply raised his sword in the last life. He wanted to die to escape her. Now he just wanted to kill her. No longer could this realm support them both. One of her guardians sensed this and rushed forward, while she screamed to keep him alive after all. He was their golden finger, their sect's treasured tool. This foolish command was of course in his favor, for as they tried only to subdue him, he would not return such kindness. Even though there were many of them, they all fell to the flurry of his sword, and he came to realize just how weak the sect had kept their men. The maidservants were better, their martial arts stronger. But he was an Azura unleashed. He would suffer 1,000 cuts in order to end their mistress' life. That said, once he saw the light dim in her ugly eyes, he reached for a pill in order to save his own. "You bastard!" A wraith of Een screamed and rushed towards his unguarded back. However, hers was also so and blinded by fury. She failed to sense the man behind her before he took her life. "My martial uncle has also been avenged," Huang Jianyong mentioned as he looked at the lifeless corpse of the woman who had a hand in this cycle of destruction. For it were her whispers on that man's pillow that had made him stray and caused his rising envy that he might steal that which did not belong to him. His eyes turned to his beloved, and an expression of concern filled them as they flashed over his numerous wounds. "Are you well, Xiai will live, Jian?" He reassured his husband. "I am sorry that I caused you worry, do not be." Beloved, the man reached for him, cupping his hands about his jaw and pressing their foreheads gently together. "I should not have brought you here, no." "You were right to," he replied, returning the intimate touch. "There is something else I need to do. You may not agree to it at first, but it surely is necessary. Come with me always." And with that, Xing Xia led Huang Jianyong to the distant, dark room, where his former self was trapped and was waiting to be freed. Tale of a False Phoenix. Author's note, and now for something completely unexpected. Some claim that the birth of a true dragon or a true phoenix is heralded by signs within the heavens, such as stars streaking across the sky, flocks of cranes circling the child's birthplace, the skies giving blessed rain to a land upon the brink of drought. On the day the crown prince was born, it was said that all of the flowers in the empress courtyard bloomed at once. Such a pretty tale. But who but eunuchs and maidservants were able to see it? Still, the emperor believed it and went so far as to title the babe upon his 100-day celebration. Many officials and nobles attended the celebration, with more and more extravagant gifts to give face to the emperor and empress and show their support to the little prince. Whilst in his cups, my father went to visit my mother in her courtyard, and it was on this day that I was conceived. Perhaps unsurprisingly, my mother took this as a favorable sign. "Your Highness," I kowtowed to my master, offering complete submission and throwing away dignity at his feet. The man's thin lips curved at their corners. His icy appearance did not warm from this slight smile. Instead, the air felt some 10 times colder. Despite this, he was a handsome man, with sharp phoenix feather eyes, a square jawline and white scholarly skin with a hint of wheat. His dark eyes were like frozen black diamonds and seemed to bore into one's soul. But I could tell that my groveling pleased him. Only when others bowed before him, gifting them their bodies to be stepped upon, to be broken or pampered at his whims, was he content. Fortunately, this was not a lesson that I learned the hard way. "Rise, the prince finally has a use for you." His smirk deepened, his eyes trailing over my body. I had to suppress the shudder that rippled inside of me. My master had never taken pleasure in viewing my body, had never even taken pleasure in my body. He despised the very sight of me, leading to my suffering at the hands of his other concubines and servants in my past life. Only in that life, I managed to pull off a scheme leading to my bearing his only son and heir. He'd had no choice but to recognize me over his beloved wife. But rebirth was like taking a small butterfly and displacing it from where it was meant to be to 10,000 miles away. The ripples in time had slowly circled outward until the future became unrecognizable. Still, I was not completely dismayed by this fact. After all, although I had reached the ultimate desire of any ambitious woman, I had barely warmed that gracious seat before it was ripped away from me. Gifting you would make him wary of you. Thus this prince must have you introduce yourself to him in an entirely different way. My husband and master continued, as if I was a commodity to do with as he pleased, and sadly this was completely true. No matter how I hated this fact, I could only bow my head and obey him. A woman or male girl was expected to obey her father, her husband and her son in this life, and should not have intelligence or will of her own. Teaching a girl or child the etiquettes and arts was just another manner of displaying them. Ultimately, they would set aside these talents, if they were fortunate enough to run their homes and raise their children. And if they were not, then they were really no better than one of those women selling their talents within the brothel. Just that they sold them to just one man, and the pay was his humble blessings that may or may not take fruit. The man's wife could at least have some say in running the inner courtyard. The emperor disdained those officials who pampered the concubine to suppress the wife. But a concubine only could live a good life if her background was strong, if her paternal family was strong for then. Even if the wife would insist on obeisance, she would not abuse her authority too much and invite the wrath of her husband and the concubine's family. But if the background was weak, or there was no family. In my last life, my family's fate was not good. My father was a mediocre official. My older brother believed his good-for-nothing friends and invested in a project that would not only fail, but caught the eagle eye of an opponent of my father. He impeached my father, hinting that my failure of a brother was investing in illegal activities, and brought forth proof that silver-tongued bastard that convinced those young masters was indeed a fraud. But there was no actual business, let alone illegal ones. But the emperor believed it, and my family was ruined. My status in the second prince's house fell just 2 weeks after I married in. I was thrown to a tiny, broken-down building in the inner courtyard. My previous place given to a favored shoe daughter to add to the salt already scarring my wounds. At my lowest, I came to realize that I could only rely on myself in this lifetime. I held on to the belief of my concubine mother that I was destined for greater things and learned how to scheme and how to survive. In this life, I saved my brother from making a mistake, but in doing so, I allowed my older sister to path the way to a new disaster for the family. It seemed that theirs was a fate of falling, dragging me down with them. How foolish that I never realized my family was never to be a pillar in my life, but an anvil perched upon a precipice, ready to drag me down into the mire. I was only fortunate that the first wife of my husband was no longer a jealous woman made bitter by her beloved's acceptance of several concubines after their marriage, but a small, quiet girl that originally had less background than my own. This was one of the ripples caused by my rebirth. Originally, the princess consort of the second prince was his childhood sweetheart, a relationship he'd nurtured for a long time, but not because it was her. That delusion was her own, but rather as she was her father's daughter. Her father was the famous General Tao, and the second prince had high ambitions. Despite the auspicious signs accompanying his older brother, the crown prince's birth, my marriage to the second prince had also been part of his considerations for creating a network of support. Once he had the ability of removing the crown prince and making himself favorable on merit and connections. A pity that connections severed and died. But although the crown prince was fated to die, for his was a life of overconsumption and excess leading to a demise that could not be blamed by subtle guidance in both of my lives. It seemed that the emperor had no intention of allowing the second prince to easily take his throne. At the ripe age of 33, the empress actually managed to conceive dragon and phoenix twins in my past life, giving her new hope for a second crown prince to share her blood. When the little one was designated so, my husband went mad and staged a coup, leading his secret armies and those held by his trusted confidants to siege the palace and take the throne by force. In order to give his only son legitimacy, the usurper emperor had to then deal with his father-in-law and wife, forcing the man into a corner to die and feeding his wife poison. Then I became empress and my son crown prince. I had achieved what I was born to do. I will leave at once, my prince, I murmured obediently, secretly smiling in my heart. With only a maid to accompany me, I was taken to be abandoned in the area close to the royal hunting grounds to await my future husband, my former brother-in-law, the seventh prince. I wanted to laugh to mock the second prince, this frigid husband who had only ever thought of what benefits his wives could bring him, how he could use them, how he could discard them. Useless trash pen. Now what was he left with? An inner courtyard barren of sons, and a wife he refused to touch. And he still thought he could overthrow destiny, marry that childhood sweetheart his loins still longed for. Could my family overthrow destiny? Could the crown prince survive his fate? Would a man who was a serpent sit legitimately on the throne of a dragon? He who had once barely tainted that throne with his unpleasant aura was removed and charged with the crime of uprising, of regicide, and of usurping the rightful crown prince. In his rush to obtain what he wanted, he failed to realize that the body of the toddler left in the ashes of the Empress Palace fire was not his little brother, but a substitute. The real child had been smuggled out by another, while his mother and sister burned in sacrifice. That maid had been a person of the seventh prince, and as his savior, who else was better as a regent to rule until the crown prince was of age? That was if he lived that long, unfortunately. I did not live that long, so was unable to bear witness. My son and I were forced to drink poison as part of the punishment to second prince's household. There could be no survivors. So now I would seduce the seventh prince, become his woman, bear his children, and continue to my rightful ascension. Only in this life it would be trickier, actually. The plan to get in his good graces was not difficult. I had a talent in making perfumes, incense, and wines. It was how I captured the second prince in my past life, long enough to obtain his seed after all. And now that talent was so much improved. In addition, I had already set in motion these events long ago. You see, seventh prince is not just the adversary that second prince could not tear down. He was also the man I loved. It seemed like an eternity had passed since I first saw that elegant, suave man. His princely aura so much more regal than his numerous brothers. His age was only a couple of years second prince's junior. The emperor was particularly amorous following the birth of his empress son. But his lesser years made no difference to his bearing. As if he were the light, and they were mere parodies of his shadow. My small heart was aflutter just to see him from afar. My feelings might not have evolved into anything was it not for him then saving my reputation at a flower viewing party thrown by the empress. My mother had secured an engagement as a consort to second prince. While it was not the position of first wife, I would hold more respect than an ordinary concubine. My Biaogia was jealous and attempted to frame me. Were it not for seventh prince, I would have been disgraced, forced to commit suicide to save my reputation that had almost been soiled by a random man. Even then, second prince did not believe that I was not at fault at all. Perhaps even thought I was throwing myself at the brother he hated the most. So although my marriage was not rescinded, I was forced to suffer the humiliation of becoming a low concubine. It was the beginning of my husband's dislike for me, one that seemed to leak without reason into my second life. I wondered on occasion if he saw through my buried infatuation with seventh prince. Reborn, I believed I was free to pursue seventh prince, to freely love him, and to be freely loved in return. I ensured our paths crossed more than once. I believed he would remember me, perhaps gain an affection for me, but for my fate. Still, once I saved the seventh prince and had him taken the aroma on my body, he would not be able to forget me. I would be an addiction to his senses, someone he would long for and could not abide to be without. However, despite that, I would still need to move fast. He would eventually become immune to the smell. I didn't doubt, though, that he would love me as much as I loved him by the time that occurred. Just as second prince, seventh prince had a ger wife. All of the princes had ger wives. The cause of this was indirectly because of me and my rebirth. As mentioned, my brother was an idiot and a waste. But he was the heir, and my mother spoiled both him excessively. He had been a much-longed-for son born some 6 years after his legitimate sister. He was 2 years my senior. One of the hedonistic friends was a scheming bastard and worked together with the fraudster to drain my brother and the others of wealth. That youth who pretended to be noble was the secret son of a famous courtesan. She had managed to establish a household for him, using the old fallen daughter of a noble as his grandmother, giving him a background. But the taint of his blood could not so easily be forgotten. He hated that mother, hated the circumstances of his birth, and hated legitimate young masters, insanely believing that they were all laughing at him. At 18 years old, he already had his hands in numerous shady businesses, mostly gambling. But also his caravans would trade in contraband across the borders into other countries and later our country's secrets. I discovered this accidentally when the second prince, come emperor, was trying to secure his rule. That man turned 26 in that life. was eager to establish himself as a loyal supporter of the new emperor, to legitimize his gambling businesses and whorehouses, only to stupidly reveal himself in front of a visiting princess and her entourage and be denounced a spy. He was tortured until he confessed all his dark history and his wealth confiscated. Not that any of that did my former husband any good in the end. It's not hard to drop hints and send anonymous letters. Let others discover the truth and think it was all their idea. My brother led the hedonistic crown prince to a brothel, where he managed to overhear a conversation regarding his friend and that man's wealth and shady businesses. That was prior to the crown prince's demise by a month. I believe so my stupid brother forgot all about it, until that friend tried to convince him to invest in him and the fraudster's venture. The one thing my brother never wished to do was to drag down our official father so miraculously. He had a minor epiphany and delayed agreeing to anything. Instead went to speak to my father. My father visited a magistrate friend, asking him to investigate that man, and of course with that man still young and lacking in experience fell foul of the law and was imprisoned before eventually being exiled. If one thinks about it, not a bad fate compared to being dead. I actually did him a favor. My father and brother were praised in court for being smart and vigilant. The villain had already 2 underground gambling establishments and a caravan trading illegal goods. Digging out a weed before its roots were any deeper was a good thing for both country and court. The emperor was pleased. He began to favor my sister, who just happened to be a concubine in his hidden palace. She was elevated in status, thus elevating us, though I still failed to escape my own marriage. However, stupidity seemed to be a fatal flaw in the my siblings. Older sister became conceited, and her ego swelled thanks to the flattering of her lesser concubine sisters. Like an arrow already drawn in a bow they were guiding. They aimed her to fly towards the empress, only to discard her once she hit. The dragon and phoenix twins were lost before the empress ever knew of their existence. My stupid sister was easily discovered as the perpetrator, and as such, she and my family had to give up their lives as payment for the crimes against the empress. Bitter and sterile, the woman then schemed against the entire royal family and bought out a soothsayer to convince the emperor that the crown prince should be selected by the heavens, and that the gods would reveal their choice when the crown princess gave birth to the son and heir. To this end, all of the princes were wed to brides. The trembling in second prince's palace. I had never met in my previous lifetime that boy's status had been lower than mine before my family fell. Our paths had originally not been destined to pass. However, 7th prince's princess consort I had met, he had married 7th prince in that lifetime as a second wife. His first princess had died in childbirth, leaving behind a son. Their marriage had been arranged by the Empress Dowager, who had been impressed with the and his family. They had not just married him off as a connection for their sons, and wanted the best for him, even if that meant delaying his marriage. They hadn't wanted to marry him to 7th prince either. But the Empress Dowager was insistent, and the 7th prince filial. So they bowed to the heavens, to the emperor and empress, his parents, and to each other. He benevolently raised his stepson and bore his own son a year later. For this reason, I feared the fertility of that wife. If he was to bear the oldest son, I would not so easily expand my roots in this palace. He was already pregnant when I walked through the doors under the besotted eyes of my new husband. I took drugs to ensure the illusion that I was just as fertile as that bastard and conceived on my wedding night. My new husband was very pleased, gifting me with many treasures, drawing the jealous attention of his concubines. Some disdained me, some tried to flatter me. I particularly took note of one small concubine with an abrasive nature, who'd also been favored often before I entered as a second wife, and gifted her with a pretty nail polish. It wasn't high quality and would easily flake off during everyday activities, such as washing her hands preparing food. The wife lost his child a week after my pregnancy was confirmed. I could only laugh joyously in the walls of my courtyard, stroking my stomach cheerfully. Remember why we are here, my maid grasped my wrist, digging her nails into the flesh as she reminded me. I sneered inwardly and pulled my arm away, despite the bloody scratches she left behind. I have not forgotten, I replied, narrowing my eyes. Just isn't this what second prince wanted? No air for seventh prince. Her lips thinned as she restrained herself. I trailed my eyes over her luscious body in disgust and had to readjust my opinion about her. Second prince would never leave anything to chance. If I were to fail or to betray him, of course he required a backup plan. I suspected this maid's true purpose following me here, especially when the blood and flesh of my own child spilled out between my legs. A lesson from the second prince, she murmured as she helped clean my weakened self. I gritted my teeth. This maid could no longer remain here. I accused her of making a mistake, demoted her to a third-ranked servant, and transferred her to the laundry department. See if she could go against me now. I underestimated her skill. She eventually managed to escape the laundry department to sneak into my husband's bed. Fortunately, my spell was still woven upon him. He pushed her away in disgust. I laughed in her face after I summoned her and forced her to drink a concoction of my devising before having a few trusted old women guide her Wang Fei's room. Thus, she became my knife against the second potential heir and lost her own life in the process. Everything was going my way. I now had control of the household. Allowing Wang Fei to be only an ornament, I ensured that none of my husband's other concubines would ever bear any more of his children once his immunity to my scent became apparent. Once I had born Wang Ye's first son, I thought I might even allow that girl to bear a prince so the throne became my husband's. Second prince would ensure that no other princess consort bore a son in the meantime. So I had the time to enact my plan, however. It was not easy watching the man you love disappear twice a month, 4 times a month almost every night, into another person's courtyard, even if that person was his wife. I had borne him a daughter and his only son. Why was he no longer looking at me? I was supposed to be his wife, his empress. He was mine, not that little bitch's. So why were his eyes as cold as second prince's when he looked at me? Why did they soften when others politely complimented his Wang Fei? It was intolerable. A mountain could not hold 2 tigers. This palace could not bear the divine right of 2 phoenixes. That false phoenix and his unborn child had to die. I would gain the dragon throne for my husband by myself. I had the means, I just needed the opportunity. But why did my heartbeat falter when witnessed my husband's legs give way when he heard the news that the bastard's last child was lost? Why did it hurt so when I saw the unshed tears form in his eyes when the physicians told him that Wang Fei was upon his last breath? Why was I being forced to drink poison in punishment for that bastard's demise? Why? I screamed at him as he walked away without emotion, without any hesitation after declaring his will. You know, the soothsayer's words were underlined with silver and gold. You said that you would never give up the fight for the throne. Regardless of Wang Fei, he offered me a bitter laugh. What is the point of ascending the throne if every time I turn towards my empress? I don't see him, but didn't you hate him? He's a disgusting grr. I never hated him. I only hated myself for hurting him, for exasperating that hurt. And even though I swore that I would protect him this time, he did not finish the words in his mind. Then what about me, I had to know. Was I not important to you? He seemed to stop, to think, to give me a fleeting glimpse of hope. Older brother hatched his plot well. I really was infatuated by you, but for a long time. I have never understood why. You are very talented, but you are now nothing more than a blunt knife. An arrow at the end of its flight. Don't worry. Your children will follow you in a few short years. I won't allow your blood to taint my descendants. If there is a next life, do not cross my path. I cannot guarantee you a whole corpse if you do. Goodbye, Miss Foam. His words were more deadly than the poison rushing through my veins in this life or the last.